All right, welcome yet again to History in the Kitchen. This is our Native American Foodways episode. Rachel, can you say something to make sure we have your audio? Because I don't think I did just a moment ago.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now. Perfect. Just double checking. All righty. So I am going to throw up our screen share and we are going to get started with our cooking session today. If you are cooking along with us, you will want to grab these ingredients and have them in your kitchen and available. We are making, as you may have seen if you downloaded the recipe, if you did not get a chance to download the recipe earlier, I will be throwing it up into the chat. I know some folks had an issue with the URL that was included in the confirmation email. I will put that in the chat just again in a second. So I apologize for any challenges in getting that downloaded, but we are making a Three Sisters salad, which will involve the vinaigrette on the left and the salad ingredients on the right. Give everybody a chance to take a look at that, grab those things if you want, and I will get the recipe into the chat in just a moment. For those of you who are used to participating in this program with us, you may recall that we often share a historical recipe. And sometimes we don't have one. That is the case with our Native American foodways as well. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So we have no historic recipe. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But I'm going to take down our screen share so we can talk a little bit about why that is. And also drop that file into the chat as promised. So if you're missing the recipe, that's coming in the chat as a file that you can download. If you have issues with that, I'm also going to drop the direct link to our website in the chat as well. Alrighty. So again, thank you for joining us this morning. Rachel and I are super excited about this topic. Today for History in the Kitchen, we are honoring Native American heritage and Indigenous History and Heritage Month. We at Gunston Hall are on Native lands, and the Native people who once lived here do not exist anymore as a cohesive unit, or may have been killed off entirely as a part of families like the Masons. And in fact, the Masons themselves in previous generations, removing those people from these lands in order to inhabit them themselves. The people who lived here at Gunston Hall were often called the Dogue. That's D-O-U, sorry, I can't spell, D-O-G-U-E. This was not a name that those people gave to themselves, however. This was a pejorative term applied to them by other peoples. They called themselves the Moyumpse. That is M-O-Y-U-M-P-S-E. And as I said, those people no longer exist as a cohesive group and may have been brought into other groups, Algonquin speaking groups like the Piscataway. I'm so sorry, Terry, I did not give you the spelling for that one, which are right across the river in Maryland. So we're going to go ahead and get started looking at the ingredients and the recipes and talk a little bit about what we do know and why we know what we know. Rachel, you ready to get started?
So the Three Sisters, if you've joined us before, I think we talk about the Three Sisters every year because it is everything. It is everything that made Native culture from North America to South America to every place is what made it possible for them to survive. And they taught it to the Europeans when they got here. And it is a companion planting system where you plant the beans and the corn together, often in a hill. And then as the corn stalk grows, the beans get to use the corn stalk to grow up. And then, so you have a natural trellis, and then once you plant squash plants, the leaves of the squash plant provide shade for the root system, and it keeps weeds from growing. Beyond just the beauty and the simplicity of that planting system, it also provided a perfect nutrition. It is full of protein, and it gives you enough protein that you don't need meat in your diet. So, and it has all the complex carbohydrates that you need to have an active life. But go ahead.
This is what nutritionists and dietitians will call a complete protein system, by combining the corn, the beans, and the squash together.
And so, but what I want to say before we get started with our three sisters is that for most of us, these are just three ingredients that taste delicious together. We often eat succotash. You're from New England, probably had succotash. But for Native peoples and all the Native peoples across the country and across this hemisphere, no wait, Lacey, what's the Americas?
The east coast of the North American continent.
It's a spiritual thing. These are not just foodstuffs. They are often a part of, it is definitely a part of the Haudenosaunee. We're also known as the Iroquois. It is part of their creation myth. In Cherokee culture, it's part of their mythology. So eating these things is a spiritual way to remember who you were and where you came from. And sadly, the people who lived on this land aren't here to tell us what they believed and how they felt about creation. So instead of doing, well, at least talk to you, instead of doing a native recipe like people like hoe cakes, where we decided this year that we're gonna do, it's a modern recipe. And I'm gonna let you talk. And while Lacey talks about that, I'm gonna mix together the vinaigrette, which is just apple cider vinegar, honey, canola oil, and salt and pepper to taste. And I'm gonna whisk them together while Lacey talks about this recipe.
So I'll try to help along for those of you who are wondering how much. Rachel just added about 6 tablespoons of vinegar. She's going to add about 3/4 of a cup of that oil, salt and pepper to taste, and about a 1/4 cup of honey. So we know what we know about Native American foodways because there has been lingering of that information in sources for history that we're used to. Today, we rely as white Western Europeans on documentary resources, typically from people who, as we might think about it, won the battle of history. They're the ones who got to write the record, the victors to the spoils, in a sense. And so we have materials from white Western Europeans that tell us a little bit about what people who are of indigenous descent were consuming in the 18th century. And we know that the things, many of them that we're including in this recipe today, are ones that Native peoples here in Virginia were consuming. As Rachel indicated, that idea of corn, beans, and squash, that wasn't native here to Virginia. It migrated into Virginia into the 18th century. So by the time white Western Europeans came to Virginia, that system already existed. All right, Rachel's on to the next step. What are we doing now?
I am going to, if you can see, nope, I'm backwards. I'm going to use an indoor grill to do this. No, wait, which Lacey, that's it. I'm going to use an indoor grill to grill zucchini and squash. But if you don't have an indoor grill, it's even better on an outdoor grill, but that was a little hard for us to do in this instance. You can do it in a pan on the stove. You do it any way that works so that you get a little caramelization on your squash. So I'm going to turn that on.
And if you have participated in History in the Kitchen in the past, you will know that Rachel and I are huge proponents of cast iron, which is why you see that cast iron skillet on the stove as a backup to this grill. That is one of the great ways to get that caramelization on. You could also use the broiler on your oven. That would work really, really well. And of course, if you are still grilling outdoors in November, feel free to have that.
My father used to shovel snow to the grill. Excuses.
Shoveling snow to the grill in the middle of the winter. Definitely down for that.
So I'm just seeding these and then I'm gonna cut them into slices. You can do it either way. I'm gonna cut them the long way. And then put them on the grill and it shouldn't take too long.
And then once they come off the grill, you'll cut them into smaller pieces.
Yes, then they'll get cut into a dice. And at the same time, talking about the cast iron, we have corn. It's not corn season anymore where we are, so we have frozen corn, which works just as well. And it has been thawed. And what I'm gonna do with this to get a little char on it is I'm gonna heat up my cast iron pan, medium high, and I've done this in nonstick pans and it sticks. Sometimes it sticks to the cast iron. I think it depends on how your corn is feeling that day. But I'm gonna heat this up and then I'm gonna add a little oil. I'm gonna put the corn in a single layer as much as I can, and I'm not gonna touch it for 5 minutes. As much as I wanna touch it, I'm gonna try really hard to not touch it and let it get brown. And after that 5 minutes, I'll give it a little stir and see how much more time it needs.
So we had a question in the chat on whether or not you can use carrots in this recipe. You absolutely could. We selected a recipe, if you read the recipe document that was published by the National Museum of the American Indian in their Medicem cookbook, and it's also one that they had on their website as well. So all of the ingredients in this dish today are native to the Americas. Honey was produced here, apple cider vinegar was not so much, but they were producing vinegars from other fruits. The squashes, the tomatoes, those are all native plants to the Americas. Carrots, on the other hand, are not. If I remember correctly, they're native to like Middle Europe. I'd have to look it up to be sure. You can absolutely use carrots in this dish. We are following the recipe as the National Museum of the American Indian has recommended to produce this modern but thoroughly native dish. So how do we know some of these things? Well, as I mentioned just a minute ago, the material that we have that we often look at is documentary evidence. For Native peoples across the world, oral history is the way that they documented their tradition, their culture, and their history. So today, we often see those oral histories coming back as Native peoples reclaim their history. And we at Gunston Hall are super excited, even though the Native peoples who lived right here on this peninsula no longer exist as a group, we are forging connections with the Native peoples that surround us and try our best to help them reclaim their culture, reclaim their history and their food traditions. And we're so excited to be able to do that with this Three Sister Salad today. And I'm hoping that next year, this program will look very different as we bring in some of our Native partners to help us explore that food culture. All right, it looks like Rachel has gotten all of the zucchini on the grill. Wasn't quite enough space for everything on there.
Space for everything at once, but that's fine, because this grill cooks both sides at once, it should cook pretty quickly. My pan is hot, so I'm just gonna add some vegetable oil. We can see it falling up nicely.
It's spreading nicely. I can tell that's a hot pan. I don't even have to be in the room. That slightly viscous oil just split.
There, you can hear it.
We can hear the sizzle. That looks beautiful. So you're getting that in a nice even layer. If you are doing this with kids at home, Rachel is breaking the rules.
Do as I say, not as I do.
please use a spoon or other material to make that a little bit safer for your youngsters. We do recommend a spatula. Oh, I can imagine the smell. So we have a question, Rachel, in the chat about how to care for our cast iron. Do you only
Sorry, I can't hear you over my corn.
Ah, okay. I'll be a little bit louder. Do you only ever wipe cast iron after cooking, or how do you clean it?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
I wipe it down with a paper towel first to get off as much of the whatever stuck to it as I can, and then I usually use just a tiny bit of soap, especially if I've been cooking hot dogs or something else that's gonna leave a scent in the pans. The pans out in the hearth kitchen always smell deliciously like bacon. But so I'll do a little bit of soap to clean any of that off, and then when it's wet, I'll put it either in a hot oven or on a burner to make sure it is completely dry before I put it away. That's the most important part. And then I sometimes coat it with a little bit of oil. I sometimes don't. Honestly, I'm feeling that day.
I do the same thing, and I do that with all of the cast iron materials that we have here. Yep, I see soap in the questions. Yes, we do use soap, particularly if there is lots and lots and lots of grease. Soap, if you're careful and if you make sure that your cast iron gets very clean, so you rinse all of the soap out very well, and then dry your cast iron pan very, very well, it will be fine. I know that is a very controversial topic. I can see we have someone who says, I use coarse salt and a little water, never soap, dry and oil, and that's fine.
Oh, I forgot that part.
Everybody has a different way to keep their cast iron, but we do use soap, particularly because a lot of the cast iron that we use here at Gunston Hall is stuff that we also use to serve food to the public, and we are concerned about things like cross-contamination and cross-contact, which are opportunities for either food bacterias and viruses or allergens to cross between one dish and another. So we always use soap. But as Rachel indicated, get it super, super dry. And then if the cast iron pan has lost its sheen, that's absolutely when I will add a little bit of oil, pop it back on the stove to get that that oil hardened and seasoned and revigorating the seasoning of that pan. How are your squash looking?
Organize my asbestos fingers. We're getting a good sear on them.
Nice. That's some good color. I saw nothing.
Things, how you like your zucchini and squash cooked, how much you like it cooked, totally up to you. And while I'm waiting, I'm just sitting here cutting cherry tomatoes in half. We have 2-color cherry tomatoes. They're so pretty. And I'm adding them to the bowl where I will eventually construct the salad. And I'm starting to smell my corn. And if you're a new cook, one of the best ways to tell if anything you're cooking is getting towards done is, can you smell it? If you can start smelling your brownies in the oven, go check it.
Probably done.
And see if those are done. So once you start smelling it, it's a good time to check.
Mm-hmm. So while Rachel is stirring up her corn, checking on those squashes, I'm going to throw another PowerPoint up on screen. We're talking about our Three Sisters salad today in particular, and Rachel talked a little bit about the food culture connected with beans and corn and that Three Sisters complex. What I wanted to talk about with these traditional foods, and you see some others that we're not actively cooking today, is the ecosystem that Native peoples had before Europeans first encountered them. as Rachel indicated, we've got this really amazing grouping of plants in the Three Sisters that were part of the traditional, what we would think of as traditional food cultivation and traditional farming. Europeans who encountered these might have thought that Native Americans' farms looked very haphazard and very cluttered because of this system and the way that it worked, but they were able to recognize a garden or a farm when they saw these items. That wasn't always the case. And that's particularly true in the case of the pawpaw, which is our fruit in the middle of the screen. This is a really interesting fruit that many Americans don't know anything about anymore, because we, as white European, we are folks of white European and African folks of African descent, just haven't encountered in the same way, because it's not something that has been cultivated in a modern sense. So people of native cultures were in their gardens harvesting and growing things like the beans, the corn, the squash, and the tomatoes. But they also very carefully cultivated these wild spaces so that they would produce seasonally things that folks could eat in different times and different places. So when Europeans first encountered the New World, particularly here in North America, they were looking at what they saw to be these amazingly bountiful, untouched landscapes full of berries and fruits and all kinds of other things that they didn't realize that native peoples like the Piscataway, like the Algonquins, like the Haudenosaunee, which Rachel mentioned earlier, and I'm going to pause here and give Terry a second to catch up.
I just put my corn into the bowl where I'm gonna put the salad, and I'm gonna chop a few more tomatoes, that's all. Oh, but I wanted to say, you can see that there wasn't much sticking in the cast iron pan, which is good, because getting corn that is stuck to your pan off. So, but I'm gonna let it cool before I do anything to it. But if you think it's gonna smell, this is also a good time to just
Salt your pan down.
put some salt in there and let it absorb. All right, go ahead.
So that's fine. So what all of these native peoples were doing were cultivating these landscapes in a way that Europeans didn't recognize, but they saw this beautiful untouched landscape. What we know now, of course, is that the native people who were living here in Virginia were in fact cultivating these orchards and berry patches and things in different spaces that weren't necessarily right up next to their village. And so things like the pawpaw was a huge part of their food culture in the 18th century. But we don't see that today because it's something that we have decided not to cultivate. It's not as shelf stable. It's not as meaningful for us to utilize when we're doing farming the way that we do today. We do see some other native foods, nuts and things like pecans and hazelnuts are ones that are native and have been moved into cultivation, but they're a lot more stable. All right, so Rachel's cutting up her squash. She's got her mixing bowl there off camera. I'm gonna pop this up. I'm gonna pop this up on screen. I'm gonna take down Rachel and me so that y'all can see this a little bit better. The squash looks beautiful.
If you have kids who won't eat squash, this is a good way to do it, especially if it's not squishy. You keep it a little bit firm.
I don't like squash. I'm gonna eat this, but I don't particularly
thought asparagus was the most horrible food until he had grilled asparagus, and then he was like this.
All right.
So you see, I'm just adding everything as I go to this bowl. Next, we got beans. So
what kind of beans did we decide to go with today, Rachel?
The recipe calls for cranberry beans, which you're probably like, I've never heard of a cranberry bean, but we often call them, this is probably gonna be backwards.
Nope, it's facing the right way. Roman beans.
So right there with your other Goya beans, I took these out of the can earlier and rinsed them really well. I just put them back in the can so I wouldn't dirty another dish. So they are drained and rinsed.
So let me take down Rachel. I see in the chat that we can't see what Rachel is doing.
Oh.
All right, if I take that spotlight down, can you now see what Rachel is doing? If you can't, give a shout out.
Just gonna grab some squash.
All right, I'm sorry for, I'm getting some mixed messages. I see some folks can see it and some folks can't. I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what else to do, except if you have it set at gallery view, you might want to change it to speaker view instead. And you can do that most Zoom sessions. It's up in the right-hand corner of the screen. You click on a little button that says view, and your options will be gallery, speaker, and multi-speaker. Could be an issue with your own personal Zoom. I am so sorry about that. We should be able to see all of this in the recording, which we will be posting later on our website. I can't promise exactly when it will go live, but it should go live before our next session in December. Ooh, can you hold that right up in front of the camera, Rachel?
There, I'm holding it in the
other camera.
You can see it's just all mixed together in there. And back on the, and what I like, so any of you who've been here before know Lacey and I have, between us food allergies and between us food preferences, I like putting hot squash and the hot corn in with the tomatoes, so it makes them a little bit juicier. It sort of warms them up a little bit.
I'm imagining the smells. If you guys aren't cooking along, I can imagine like the jealousy that you might have of what Rachel is doing right now, because this looks delightful. Like I said, I don't really do squash, but I'm ready to eat this. This looks amazing.
Just gonna try some real quick to see if it needs more salt and pepper. It's the tomatoes. I didn't salt the tomatoes, so a little bit more.
And while Rachel is doing that, I'm going to throw our screen share up one more time because there's one last food item that I want to look at. We've talked a lot about plants today, but we haven't yet talked about protein. We talked about how the beans and the corn together, that makes a perfect and complete protein. But we do know that people who were here in Virginia before Western Europeans had other protein sources. One of those was shad. And we know that because in part, shad were still incredibly plentiful in the 18th century when George Mason and other people of European descent were in this area as well, and in fact kept fisheries for them. We know that people of native descent were smoking their shad very often to preserve it over the course of the year. Salt mining was really challenging in earlier periods of history. It was quite a lot of labor, and smoking, particularly for fish like shad, was really, really viable to help keep food for a long time. But like the beans and the corn, that Three Sisters complex, we know that there is a spiritual component to the shad. They were, as I said, seasonal. They arrived at a time of year. They came up the Potomac and in the Chesapeake Bay area at a time when other fresh food and stored food stocks were at their lowest, very early in the spring. They were very, very bony. If you've ever eaten a shad, they have some 700, almost 800 bones in them, which is a lot of bones in a fish, but the meat was amazing and very flavorful and tender. The bony nature of that shad connects to the spiritual story that the Algonquin speaking peoples all up and down the East Coast of the Americas were part of, and that was that at one point the porcupine decided, and this very spiky porcupine decided that it was very unhappy with its life and it wanted to be a different animal. In its wisdom, the Great Spirit decided to turn the porcupine inside out and into a fish. that it would, as the story says, would forever have to swim and make the long journey to the sea and back to spawn. What's really cool is the historic Algonquin name for the shad, Tatamaho, does mean inside out porcupine. So there's this really beautiful connection to their spiritual sets of beliefs, their religious beliefs, and this food that they consumed and gave praise for on a regular basis. All right, how's that salad coming out, Rachel?
It looks yummy, it
Oh
smells
my
yummy.
gosh, it looks delightful.
Added most of the vinaigrette, but not all of it, just so I can taste it first. And having made many a salad like this before in my life, I can tell you that if you let this sit in the fridge, maybe even until tomorrow, it's gonna be even better, because all that vinaigrette's gonna.
The flavors will meld. It will be beautiful. I'm gonna take a couple of the screen shares down so we can see that salad even more. Oh, it looks amazing, Rachel. That looks like a nice little bite. Yeah, gotta get that. Gotta get that tomato in there.
Lacey?
It's fighting you.
I know it doesn't look, okay, here's a Rachel, if Rachel was in the chat, she'd ask this question. The idea that people didn't eat tomatoes, we've all heard that one, right?
Yeah.
Who is up with that?
Yeah, so I learned something in the last year, and as I should mention that every time Rachel and I do this program, we learn something new, which is super cool. One of the reasons that we suspect that people of European descent were not consuming tomatoes is because they were often eating on pewter dishes that contained lead. Lead and the acids in tomatoes interacted and caused lead to be consumed by the person who was eating it. And so there may be some idea that tomatoes are poisonous because people who are consuming them are also consuming with those tomatoes lead. Not that they knew that over much in the past. I don't think that the name helped either. This plant belongs to a family of plants called deadly nightshades, which does include a very poisonous plant, but also includes tomatoes, peppers, and potatoes, all foods that we eat all the time, and all of which came from the Americas. So we had another question in the chat about whether or not we can use delicata squash. Yeah, absolutely you could. As we said today, we're focusing on those three sisters complex, so the squash, the beans, and the tomatoes. Sorry, the squash, the beans, and the corn. But many squashes of a huge different varieties are all American. Using a delicata squash is going to change the texture a little bit because it doesn't have that firmness that the summer and the zucchini squash have. So we've got just a few minutes left today. So firstly, Rachel, I want to know, how did it taste?
It tasted delicious.
Fabulous. I can't wait.
I'm gonna leave the rest of the vinaigrette out of it for now, and I'm gonna let it suck up some of the vinaigrette that's in here. You can see it's pooling at the bottom.
Yeah, you've got a nice dressing built up down there.
So I'm gonna let it suck up some of that into the beans especially, and add more of the vinaigrette if we need it later.
Yeah, and as Rachel was indicating earlier, letting this dish sit in the fridge is going to help those flavors meld and just make it even more wonderful. Now, before we leave for today, we've got a few minutes left on the official recorded session. I do want to talk a little bit about other resources that you might want to know about if you're interested in learning more. So we talked very much at the surface level on this 45-minute program. There's only so much that we can get into when we're talking about history and cooking food, but you might want to learn more. So here are some of the places that you can do that. And if you're worried about scribbling all of these down before we take the screen share down, don't worry, I'm going to pop a resource list into the chat in just a second. It'll also go out with the recording when we send that, when we post that on our website in a little while. So firstly, of course, and nationally available here in America, and of course abroad, is National Museum of the American Indian. This is a compilation museum from all of the tribes in America today. A huge grouping of their history, of material culture. So there are lots and lots of items. They do amazing online programming and all kinds of other resources. On their website. You might also find local museums. A local one for us is the Patawomeck. This is a Native group of people down in Fredericksburg. It's about 40 miles south of us here at Gunston Hall. We actually know that previous generations of the Masons had interconnections with this group of people. They do have a museum, they have spaces to engage, and they also have some material on their website. If you're curious about who the Native peoples are in your area, check out the land map. This is not something that is just focused on English North America. It is focused around the world and will give you Native peoples around the world. As you can see, it's actually a product of a group in Canada. So feel free to check out that Native digital land. If you want to learn more about food culture, here are some spaces where you can do that. That same group that has the museum down in Fredericksburg, Virginia, they are also reclaiming their history by figuring out and reclaiming the work that was done to make eel pots for fishing eels in the Rappahannock River, right down there in Fredericksburg. There are also groups that are talking about food knowledge and traditional food culture. So I recommend checking out the North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, Indigenous Food Knowledges Network, and the Wild Berries. All three are focused on areas different than we are here at Gunston Hall, but they are pursuing this same idea of food sovereignty and food knowledge. Lastly, we also recommend this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. By the title, you can tell it's not purely focused on food, but that is a big part of what she talks about in her book. Like I said, I'll share that resource list in the chat in just a second. But if we have any last thoughts or questions, please feel free to let us know.
They're called cranberry beans. They're called Roman beans. But if you put cranberry bean into Google, it is going to come up with a huge list of other names for those beans. But if you're in the grocery store, your Goya Roman beans are the same as cranberry beans.
Mm-hmm. But you could use any kind of bean. Most of the beans that we see in the grocery store do hail from the Americas. The one major exception, or two major exceptions, are chickpeas and black-eyed peas, which hail from other parts of the world.
And I think you'd want a bean with enough bite, so a bigger bean.
Yeah.
Beans, but any bigger kidney beans, fine.
Yep. So the last thing as we wrap up, those of you who are ready to hop off, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. I do want to mention that we are coming back next month. Rachel, what are we doing next month? I challenged Rachel's brain. We're making drinks next month. We're doing non-alcoholic drinks in December. We're making one of our current favorites, and we hope it will be one of yours as well. It's called, oh my goodness, it just went out of my brain. I feel very embarrassed. We are making a simple syrup that is flavored with orange flower water. It is delightful. And we'll be mixing it up in lemon water, and we'll also be making an apple water. So we're super excited. We hope to see you again in December for another session of History in the Kitchen. And in just a second, I'm going to turn off that recording. So if you have questions that you want to shout out loud, we'll turn that recording off so you won't be captured, and we'd love to hear from you.